What are some recent psychology developments in the last 10 years? Story 1. In 2015, independent research teams attempted to replicate 100 published psychological studies. Only 39% worked. For social psychology specifically, the subfield behind most of the TED Talks, best-selling books, and corporate training programs built on psychological research, the figure was 25%. Three-quarters of findings that had been accepted, taught, and cited could not be reproduced when someone tried again. That is not a methodological wobble. That is a structural problem. The casualties are significant. Ego depletion, the enormously influential theory that willpower is a finite resource that gets used up, which Barack Obama cited when explaining why he only wore gray or blue suits, failed replication with 2,141 participants, then again with 3,531. Effect size, 0. Social priming, the idea that exposure to age-related words makes people walk slower, could not be reliably reproduced. Power poses, the Mozart effect, stereotype threat in several formulations, gone or severely diminished under scrutiny. The mechanism is almost as interesting as the crisis itself. Journals published positive results and ignored negative ones. Researchers ran multiple analyses and reported only the significant one. Small samples generated large dramatic effects that larger studies couldn't reproduce. The field built an entire public-facing reputation on findings that evaporated when tested properly. Psychology is not collapsing. It is slowly, painfully becoming more honest about what it actually knows. The question is how much of what everyone already believes will survive that honesty. Story 2. Psychedelic research didn't restart because scientists suddenly became more interested in consciousness. It restarted because conventional psychiatry had run out of road for specific conditions. Treatment-resistant depression. Patients who had failed multiple antidepressants, multiple therapies, years was an unsolved problem with a growing patient population and essentially no new pharmaceutical solutions. PTSD in veterans was producing suicide rates that made the military take notice. The existing toolkit wasn't working. And sitting in Schedule 1, untouched since the Nixon-era crackdown, were compounds that researchers in the 1950s and 60s had been calling the most therapeutically promising substances they'd ever seen, before politics shut it all down. What the new trials are finding is striking. Psilocybin has demonstrated sustained remission in over 50% of treatment-resistant depression patients at 6 months. Johns Hopkins researchers have described it as potentially 4 times more effective than conventional antidepressants for long-term relief. MDMA-assisted therapy produced lasting PTSD symptom relief in 71% of veterans at 12 months across Phase 3 trials. Ketamine for alcohol use disorder achieved 86% abstinence over 6 months. These are not marginal improvements. They are category-shifting results in conditions where marginal improvement was all anyone was expecting. The mechanism matters. Psilocybin disrupts the default mode network, the brain's self-referential narrative system, the part that constructs and maintains your sense of continuous identity. Under a scan, the neural pathways associated with who you think you are temporarily desynchronized. What patients report, consistently, is not just symptom relief, but a fundamental shift in perspective, a sense of having stepped outside their own story long enough to see it differently. That is not how any existing psychiatric drug works. It is not an incremental improvement on SSRIs. It is a completely different mechanism acting on a completely different level of what it means to be a person. The research is catching up to what the compounds were trying to tell us for 50 years before anyone was allowed to listen. Story 3. The assumption baked into most of developmental psychology and into most school systems, most parenting advice, and most of the way society thinks about human development is that the critical window for learning social and emotional skills opens in early childhood and closes somewhere around late adolescence. Get it right by 18, or manage the It is a framework that has produced decades of intensive early childhood intervention programs, enormous investment in school-based social-emotional learning curricula, and a near-total absence of equivalent provision for adults. As if adults don't also struggle with emotional regulation, empathy, conflict resolution, and the ability to read a room, as if these capacities are either learned by then or permanently inaccessible. The emerging research says otherwise. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to form new connections and reorganize itself, continues throughout adult life, and the social-emotional competencies that were previously treated as developmentally fixed are now understood as genuinely trainable at self-awareness, emotional regulation, empathy, social awareness, responsible decision-making. These are skills, not fixed traits. They have the same relationship to practice that physical fitness has to exercise. And adults who missed or didn't consolidate these competencies in childhood don't lack potential. They lack targeted intervention designed for where they actually are. What's new is the assessment side. Emotional intelligence frameworks like the EQI 2.0 have been adapted for adult populations, measuring self-perception, emotional expression, interpersonal skills, stress management, and decision-making as distinct, accessible dimensions rather than collapsing everything into a single quotient. These tools are being used in clinical settings, workplaces, and higher education to identify specific deficits in adults who have spent years knowing something was consistently difficult for them without ever having a language or a framework for what it was. The field is beginning to offer adults what it has offered children for decades: the recognition that where you are is not where you have to stay. Story 4. There is a version of the mental health awareness conversation that is genuinely important: destigmatization, help-seeking, reducing the shame that has historically kept people from getting care. And then there is what happens when that conversation gets weaponized by a system that rewards diagnosis volume over diagnostic accuracy. The American healthcare system pays providers per billable diagnosis, per session, per prescription. It does not pay for the outcome. It does not pay for the resolution. It pays for the label and the ongoing management of whatever the label produces, which means the financial incentive runs directly toward more diagnoses, broader diagnoses, and longer treatment relationships, regardless of whether those diagnoses reflect genuine clinical need. The diagnostic inflation is documented. Youth mental health diagnoses surged 28% since 2018, with comorbid diagnoses rising 48%. Research points directly to provider incentives as a contributing factor. The people most affected by this are at both ends of the spectrum: the genuinely well person who gets labeled with something that reshapes their identity and their relationship with difficulty for years, and the genuinely unwell person who gets deprioritized because complex, treatment-resistant, major disorders are harder to manage and less financially attractive than the uncomplicated case that resolves neatly. Being misdiagnosed is like being given the wrong map in a storm. Not only are you still lost, but now others expect you to find your way. The professionals who see this most clearly are the ones working inside it. The middle-aged person with a genuine major disorder, complex history, real need, real work, sitting in a waiting list while clinicians fill their books with lower acuity cases whose parents pay on time and whose problems respond to 6 sessions. It is a predictable response to broken incentives. The system was designed to treat volume. It was not designed to treat the people who need it most. And until the financial architecture changes, the diagnostic inflation will continue, and the people it was supposedly built to help will keep falling through the gap it creates. Story 5. Neuroscience has always had a data problem. A single electrode recording from a single neuron generates a continuous stream of electrical signals. A modern multi-electrode array records from hundreds of neurons simultaneously. An EEG captures the summed electrical activity of millions of neurons across the entire cortex, sampled thousands of times per second across dozens of channels over the course of an experiment that might run for hours. The brain produces staggering volumes of complex, high-dimensional, non-linear data. For most of the field's history, the bottleneck was not what you could measure. It was what you could do with the measurement once you had it. Researchers drowned in signals they couldn't fully interpret, using statistical methods that flattened complexity rather than capturing it. The expansion of MATLAB and Python toolboxes over the last decade changed that relationship fundamentally. Open-source ecosystems, eGlab, Fieldtrip, MNE Python, Brian 2, the Brain Dynamics Toolbox, moved sophisticated signal processing, connectivity analysis, and neural simulation from specialized proprietary software into accessible, reproducible, community-maintained pipelines. What previously required a dedicated programming team can now be run by a single researcher with a laptop. The democratization of tooling is not a minor. It compressed what used to be months of custom code into hours of standardized pipeline, freeing research time for the part that actually requires a human brain: interpretation. Machine learning layered on top of this has added something genuinely new. Neural networks trained on brain imaging data can now classify mental states, predict cognitive load, identify early biomarkers of neurological disease, and decode intended movement from motor cortex signals with accuracy that would have seemed like science fiction a decade ago. Brain-computer interfaces that once required surgical implants are being refined using non-invasive EEG with real-time ML decoding. The tools are not just analyzing the brain's data more efficiently. They reveal structure in that data, patterns, connectivity signatures, temporal dynamics that were always there and simply invisible until the computational power existed to see them. Classical CBT was built on a simple premise: identify the distorted thought, challenge it, replace it with a more accurate one. It worked reasonably well. It also hit a ceiling, particularly for complex presentations, psychosis, and chronic conditions where thought challenging either doesn't help or actively makes things worse. The limitation wasn't the therapy. It was the underlying model of what language and thought actually are. Relational frame theory arrived as the deeper account that CBT had been missing. Developed by Stephen Hayes and colleagues from behavioral science, UFT proposes that human cognition is fundamentally relational. We don't just learn responses to stimuli. We learn to relate stimuli to each other in derived, bidirectional networks. A word doesn't just label a thing. It carries the emotional and functional properties of everything related to it in ways the person has never been explicitly taught, which is why language can make a harmless thought feel like a genuine threat, and why just telling someone their thought is irrational often does nothing to change how it functions. Process-based therapy, developed by Hayes and Stefan Hoffman, took this further. Rather than applying a fixed protocol to a diagnostic label, PBE identifies the specific functional processes driving a person's distress, psychological inflexibility, experiential avoidance, cognitive fusion, and targets those directly. It is transdiagnostic, mechanism-focused, and explicitly designed to work with the empirical reality that the same disorder looks different in different people and responds to different interventions. Recovery-oriented cognitive therapy, developed by Aaron Beck's group for serious mental illness, extends this ethos toward populations that traditional models largely gave up on: people with psychosis, schizophrenia, treatment-resistant presentations. Rather than managing symptoms toward stability, CTR works from a fundamentally different premise: that the person's aspirations, identity, and capacity for growth are not casualties of their diagnosis. The focus shifts from symptom reduction to the recovery of a valued life. For a field that spent decades treating serious mental illness as a management problem rather than a human one, that shift in premise is not incremental. It is foundational. Story 7. The human brain processes information at a rate that is, by AI standards, extraordinarily slow. The bandwidth gap between what a large language model can generate and what a human can meaningfully absorb in real time is enormous. For AI-human integration to work at any meaningful depth, not just chatbots and search queries, but genuine cognitive interfacing, that gap has to close somehow. The question nobody is asking openly is whether the gap is already being closed from the human side, without consent. TikTok, Reels, YouTube Shorts, the architecture of modern short-form media is not just fast. It is specifically engineered to deliver multiple simultaneous information streams. Text on screen while audio plays, reaction video overlaid on source video, sound effects, cuts, flashes, the brain, forced to track all of it simultaneously, is doing something it was not designed to do, and doing it millions of times. Neuroscience has documented the effects: reduced sustained attention, increased tolerance for interruption, faster context switching, and a measurable shift in the kind of stimulation required before the brain registers engagement. The threshold keeps rising. Whether this is intentional preparation for high-bandwidth AI interfacing or simply the accidental byproduct of engagement-maximizing algorithms is a question worth sitting with. The outcome is the same: either a population conditioned to process fragmented, layered, rapid-fire information at high volume is a population whose cognitive architecture more closely resembles what an AI interface would require. The conditioning is real. The question of who benefits from it, and whether the population being conditioned had any say, is one that the people doing the conditioning have not answered. Possibly because nobody asked. Story 8. If you have spent any time in mental health circles in the last decade, you have watched the therapy landscape cycle through dominant modalities the way pop music cycles through sounds. DBT was everywhere. Then EMDR became the thing everyone was training in. Now internal family systems, IFS, is having its cultural moment, appearing in mainstream media, self-help books, and therapy offices with an enthusiasm that suggests it just arrived. It didn't just arrive. It was developed in the 1980s. What arrived is the cultural appetite for it. That lag between theory and mainstream adoption tells you something important about what is actually driving the cycle. What is driving it now is a growing recognition that trauma lives in the body in ways that talk therapy cannot fully access. Bessel van der Kolk's work made this mainstream. The nervous system stores what the mind cannot process, and processing it requires working with the physiological state, not just the cognitive narrative on top of it. Somatic approaches, somatic experiencing, sensorimotor psychotherapy, polyvagal informed therapy, are already moving from specialist practice into broader clinical training. The body, long treated as the delivery mechanism for the mind's problems, is being recognized as a therapeutic site in its own right. Neurodiversity is tracking alongside this shift. The recognition that atypical nervous systems are common rather than exceptional, and that much of what gets labeled as disorder is actually a mismatch between neurotype and environment, is changing how the field thinks about accommodation, treatment, and what recovery even means. The next decade of therapy is going to look significantly different from the last. The body saw it coming before the textbooks did. Story 9. In 2015, the Open Science Collaboration attempted to replicate 100 published psychological studies. Only 39% reproduced successfully. For social psychology specifically, the subfield responsible for most of the pop psychology books, viral studies, and corporate training built on research, the figure dropped to 3/4 of findings that had been accepted, taught, and built upon simply didn't hold up when someone tried to run the same experiment again. This was not a rounding error. It was a structural indictment of how the field had been doing science. The casualties read like a greatest hits album of things everyone believed. Ego depletion, the theory that willpower is a finite resource, cited by Barack Obama to explain his wardrobe choices, failed with 2,141 participants, then again with 3,531. Effect size, 0. Social priming, exposing people to words about old age, makes them walk slower, couldn't be reliably reproduced. Power poses, the Mozart effect, gone or severely diminished under proper scrutiny. The mechanism that produced these failures wasn't fraud. It was a system that rewarded positive results, published studies with small samples, and let researchers run analyses until something significant appeared. The field is correcting itself. Pre-registration, open data, larger samples, but the public-facing reputation of psychology was built on findings that are now known to be unreliable. The self-help industry, the parenting advice, the management training, all downstream of research that evaporated when someone looked at it properly. The question is how much of what everyone already believes will survive that honesty. The answer, so far, is less than most people want to know. Story 10. The popular understanding of dopamine, that it is the brain's pleasure chemical, released when you feel good, the thing social media and junk food and drugs are hijacking, is wrong in ways that matter. Dopamine is not primarily about pleasure. It is about anticipation, prediction, and the gap between expected and actual reward. It spikes when something better than expected happens. It drops when something worse than expected happens. It barely responds to the reward itself once that reward is fully predicted, which means the dopamine system is not a pleasure dispenser. It is a learning signal, a calibration mechanism, and it is exquisitely sensitive to the ratio between effort and payoff. Anna Lembke's work on the dopamine pain-pleasure balance documents what happens when that calibration system is chronically overstimulated. The baseline shifts. The same stimulus produces less response. The brain compensates by tipping toward the pain side to restore equilibrium. What feels like boredom, anhedonia, or low-grade misery in modern life is, neurologically, a baseline recalibration after chronic overstimulation. The system is working exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed for this environment. Nature-based therapy addresses this with something the research is now quantifying rather than just recommending. Spending time in natural environments measurably reduces cortisol, lowers amygdala activity, restores directed attention capacity, and resets the dopamine system by providing low-stimulation environments where the prediction error signal can recalibrate. Japanese Shinrin-yoku research has documented physiological changes within minutes of forest exposure. The prescription was always free. It just required going outside. The brain knew this. We forgot while we were looking at our phones. Story 11. Psychology has always occupied an uncomfortable position between the humanities and the hard sciences, claiming the rigor of the latter while depending on methods closer to the former. Self-report questionnaires, behavioral observations, small samples, statistical significance thresholds that turned out to be far too permissive. The replication crisis didn't create this tension. It made it impossible to ignore any longer. When the most prestigious findings in social psychology evaporate under scrutiny, and when the researchers who built careers on those findings respond defensively rather than correctively, the question of whether psychology deserves its place alongside biology and chemistry becomes genuinely open. Academic curricula are already reflecting the answer. University psychology departments are increasingly integrating neuroscience modules, neuroimaging methodology, genetics, and computational approaches. The job market for clinical and research psychologists increasingly rewards familiarity with biological frameworks. Graduate programs that were once purely cognitive behavioral are rebranding around neuroscience-informed practice. The prestige gradient is shifting, not away from understanding human behavior, but away from the methods that claim to study it without biological grounding. What neuroscience offers that psychology currently cannot is mechanistic specificity. Not this therapy works for depression, but this intervention reduces amygdala reactivity and increases prefrontal regulation in this population measured this way. The scanner doesn't care about theoretical allegiance. It shows what changes and what doesn't. Psychology built its public reputation on studies that couldn't survive replication. Neuroscience is building its reputation on data that can be measured, reproduced, and located in actual tissue. The shift isn't a hostile takeover, it's a correction, and the students already know which way it's heading. Story 12. The placebo effect was always assumed to require deception. You had to believe the pill was real for it to work. Harvard Medical School's program in placebo studies has systematically dismantled that assumption. Open-label placebos, given to patients with full disclosure that they contain no active ingredient, consistently outperform no treatment across conditions including IBS, chronic pain, cancer fatigue, and depression. Patients told this is a sugar pill, but research shows placebos activate real healing pathways improved at rates that embarrassed the control groups. The implication is profound. The therapeutic ritual itself, the consultation, the prescription, the act of taking something, activates neurobiological pathways independent of pharmacology. The relationship, the structure, and the expectation are doing the work. The brain does not require deception to initiate healing responses. It requires participation in a meaningful ritual with a credible authority figure, which raises an uncomfortable question about how much of conventional medicine's efficacy is the molecule and how much is the theater. The finding also has implications for psychology and therapy. The non-specific factors in treatment, therapeutic alliance, structure, expectation, ritual, have long been known to account for a substantial portion of therapeutic benefit. Open-label placebo research suggests these factors are not merely adjuncts to the active ingredient. In some cases, they may be the active ingredient. The most honest thing a clinician can sometimes say is, "We don't fully know why this helps, and it may help anyway," because the brain is not waiting for a complete explanation before it starts to heal. Story 13. In 2014, University of Virginia researchers left participants alone in a room for 15 minutes with nothing to do except think. The room contained a button that would deliver a painful electric shock. 64% of men and 15% of women chose to shock themselves at least once rather than sit with their thoughts. One man shocked himself 190 times. The findings weren't about masochism. They were about the extraordinary discomfort humans experience in unstructured mental silence. The degree to which an unoccupied mind, left to itself, produces an experience aversive enough that physical pain is preferable. The researchers noted that participants in pre-study questionnaires had indicated they would pay money to avoid being shocked. Then, given the choice between boredom and pain, they chose pain. The brain, it turns out, would rather do almost anything than nothing. In a culture that has engineered every idle moment to contain stimulation, phones in every pocket, screens in every waiting room, podcasts for every commute, the capacity to simply be with one's own thoughts are not just underused. For a significant portion of people, it has become genuinely intolerable. The implications for mental health are considerable. Mindfulness practice, which asks people to do precisely what participants in this study found unbearable, is fighting against a deep neurological preference for stimulation over stillness. The fact that it works at all, and that its benefits are well documented, suggesting the discomfort is not a fixed limit. It is a threshold that can be trained. But the training is harder than anyone selling a meditation app is likely to tell you. Story 14. Benjamin Franklin neutralized a political rival not by doing him a favor, but by asking him for one, borrowing a book from his library. The rival, having helped Franklin, found himself liking him more. The principle has been replicated across psychology. Doing a favor for someone increases your positive feelings toward them, not the other way around. The direction of causality in social bonding is frequently the opposite of what everyone assumes. The mechanism is cognitive dissonance. The brain experiences discomfort if it has performed a kind act towards someone it dislikes, and resolves the dissonance by updating its opinion of the person. It is easier for the brain to decide it likes someone than to accept that it helped someone and I don't like it. The belief updates to match the behavior rather than the other way around. We do not help people we like. We like people we help. The implications run deep. Volunteer work consistently produces positive feelings toward the communities being served, not because volunteers selected people they already liked, but because helping itself generates positive regard. Therapy that involves active participation by the client, homework, exercises, self-generated insights, produces stronger alliance than therapy that delivers insight passively. Asking someone for a small favor, counterintuitively, may be more effective at building goodwill than offering them one. Franklin understood this intuitively in the 18th century. The experimental literature caught up with him in the 20th century. The social media age, built on receiving rather than giving, may be inadvertently undermining the mechanism that makes human connections feel meaningful. Story 15. Tell people they cannot do something, and a significant proportion of them will immediately want to do it more. Psychological reactance is the motivational arousal triggered when perceived freedom of choice is threatened, the cognitive equivalent of a compressed spring. Jack Brame first described it in 1966, and it has replicated consistently enough to be considered one of the more reliable findings in social psychology. The effect is not subtle. It is robust, cross-cultural, and appears across age groups from toddlerhood through late adulthood. Graphic warning labels on cigarette packaging produce reactance in some populations, driving increased consumption. Aggressive anti-drug campaigns have been documented to increase drug curiosity in targeted demographics. Parental prohibition reliably enhances the appeal of the prohibited. Forbidden fruit is not a metaphor. It is a documented neuropsychological phenomenon. The brain codes freedom of choice as a resource to be protected, and its threatened removal triggers a motivational response that often overwhelms the substantive content of the message. The lesson for anyone designing policy, parenting strategies, or public health campaigns is counterintuitive but consistent. The more forcefully you restrict something, the more desirable you make it. This does not mean that prohibition never works. It means that the manner of restriction matters enormously. Autonomy, supportive communication, providing rationale, acknowledging the person's right to choose, and framing guidelines as information rather than commands consistently outperforms directive prohibition. The iron fist produces the opposite of compliance. The open hand, more often than not, does not. Story 16. The self-help industry is built substantially on positive affirmations, statements of intended success repeated until they feel true. The research on this is, at minimum, complicated. Ibrahim Saneh and colleagues found that asking yourself, "Will I succeed?" consistently outperforms stating "I will succeed" in actual task performance. Not slightly, meaningfully, and consistently across multiple studies and task types. The mechanism is straightforward once identified. Interrogative self-talk forces the brain to construct active strategies rather than accept passive reassurance. "Will I succeed?" demands an answer. The process of generating that answer produces planning, problem identification, and motivational arousal. The brain, handed a question, goes to work. Handed a statement, it files it and moves on. The question creates an open loop that the brain is motivated to close. The statement closes the loop prematurely, providing the emotional satisfaction of resolution without the cognitive work that resolution required. The entire architecture of the motivational speaking industry, the affirmations, the vision boards, the I am statements, may be optimized for the wrong grammatical mood. This is not a minor technical correction. The billion-dollar self-help sector is selling a product that the research suggests is inferior to its free. The reframe is available to anyone. Instead of "I will finish this project," try "Will I finish this project?" and then let the brain answer seriously. What it generates in response is more useful than any affirmation. The question is the tool. The answer is work. Most people are doing it the wrong way round. Story 17. W. Phillips Davison described it in 1983. People consistently believe that mass media, advertising, and political propaganda has a stronger effect on other people than on themselves. The third person the effect is not just a bias. It is a blind spot that makes people maximally vulnerable to the exact influence they believe they are immune to. If you are certain that advertising doesn't affect your purchasing decisions, you are less likely to critically examine your purchasing decisions. If you are confident that political messaging doesn't shape your views, you are less likely to scrutinize the messaging you consume. The effect is largest in people with the highest confidence in their own media literacy. The people most likely to be encountering sophisticated influence operations are the people most convinced they are unaffected by them. In a media environment specifically engineered to exploit cognitive biases, the individual who believes they have been inoculated against those biases has simply removed one layer of defense. The most dangerous moment in any propaganda environment is when the population decides it is too smart to be the target. The third-person effect also drives policy distortions. People support censorship of content they believe harms others while consuming it themselves. They endorse media restrictions for vulnerable populations while believing themselves invulnerable. The gap between perceived effect on self and perceived effect on others is the space in which paternalistic policy lives, and it is almost always grounded in a misperception that research consistently documents and almost nobody believes applies to them, including, almost certainly, the person reading this right now. Story 18. Iris Mouse and colleagues documented what therapists had observed for years. The more directly and deliberately people pursue happiness as a goal, the less happy they tend to be. The mechanism is not mysterious once identified. Monitored happiness, the constant self-evaluation of whether you are achieving the emotional state you desire, produces a persistent awareness of the gap between current state and ideal state. That gap feels like failure. The hypervigilance required to track your own happiness also disrupts the natural, unself-conscious flow states in which positive emotion most readily occurs. The effect is compounded by cultural messaging. A society that valorizes happiness as a destination, sells it as a product, and treats its absence as a personal failing creates a population that is chronically self-monitoring for an experience that self-monitoring reliably prevents. The wellness industry, supplements, apps, retreats, journals, gratitude practices, is in the business of selling the pursuit of happiness to people whose problem is, in significant part, the excessive pursuit of happiness. The product may be sustaining the problem it claims to solve. Acceptance-based therapeutic approaches, ACT in particular, address this directly by reframing the goal from the achievement of positive emotion to the acceptance of the full emotional range in service of meaningful living. Happiness, on this account, is a byproduct rather than a destination. It arrives most reliably when people are absorbed in something meaningful enough that they stop checking whether they're happy yet. The cure for the pursuit of happiness may be to stop pursuing happiness. This is both the most counterintuitive and the most well-supported finding in the effective science literature. Story 19. Elliot Aronson demonstrated in 1966 that highly competent people who make a minor blunder, spill coffee, stumble over a word, drop their notes, are rated as significantly more likable than equally competent people who don't. The error humanizes the expert. It signals approachability, fallibility, and membership in the same category of imperfect humans as everyone else watching. The effect only works for people already established as competent. For low performers, mistakes simply confirm incompetence. But for the high performer, the strategically placed vulnerability is a relationship asset. The mechanism appears to involve a reduction in the social distance that high competence creates. Excellence can feel alienating. It establishes a hierarchy that makes the less excellent person feel diminished. A mistake punctures that distance. It says, "I am, despite appearances, the same kind of creature as you." The relief this produces translates directly into liking. The audience doesn't want a perfect person. They want an excellent person who occasionally spills their coffee, someone recognizably human despite the otherwise intimidating Ursum. The practical implications are significant for anyone in a position of authority, expertise, or public visibility. The pursuit of flawless presentation actively works against likability. Rehearsed perfection reads as distance. Carefully managed self-disclosure of genuine limitation reads as trust. Leaders who acknowledge mistakes retain more team loyalty than those who maintain infallibility. Experts who saying "I don't know" in public is trusted more than those who never admit uncertainty. The counterintuitive truth is that the performance of vulnerability, when grounded in genuine competence, is not a weakness. It is a sophisticated social technology that most people are too afraid to use it. Story 20. The research on moral licensing is one of the more uncomfortable findings in behavioral psychology. When people perform a virtuous act, they subsequently give themselves implicit permission to behave less virtuously. Buying organic groceries increases the likelihood of purchasing junk food. Donating to charity predicts reduced generosity in subsequent interactions. Voting correlates with decreased civic behavior afterward. The mechanism appears to be a moral credit account, that the brain registers a positive balance and then draws down on it. The effect has been documented across domains from environmental behavior to racial prejudice. People who had recalled a past moral action were subsequently more likely to discriminate in hiring decisions. People who had performed a charitable act were subsequently more selfish in resource allocation tasks. The good deed does not accumulate into a virtuous character. It provides a license for the next lapse. The brain, satisfied by its recent demonstration of virtue, relaxes its monitoring of the next decision. The implications for anyone trying to build consistent ethical behavior, institutional, personal, or social, are sobering. Moral highlight campaigns, virtue signaling, and conspicuous displays of ethical behavior may be actively counterproductive if they provide the psychological satisfaction that reduces subsequent vigilance. The person who announces their ethics most publicly, who performs virtue most visibly, may be precisely the person most likely to have just licensed themselves for a transgression. The research does not argue against good acts. It argues against using good acts as a reason to stop paying attention to the next one. Story 21. Most people are familiar with cryptomnesia, forgetting the source of a memory and believing it is original. Destination amnesia is its mirror, forgetting not where information came from, but where it went. The phenomenon occurs because recalling and delivering a story, joke, or piece of information consumes substantial cognitive resources. The retrieval and performance demands are high enough that the brain fails to adequately encode who received it. The result is people retelling the same anecdote to the same person multiple times, apparently without any sense of repetition. The effect is not exclusively a feature of aging, though older adults are particularly susceptible. Research suggests it occurs across populations under high cognitive load, when the speaker is managing anxiety, constructing the narrative in real time, or attending primarily to their own performance rather than to the listener, which describes most social conversation most of the time. The brain's attention during storytelling is substantially directed inward toward retrieval and execution, leaving insufficient resources to encode the outward reality of who is present and listening. The practical implication is both humbling and clarifying. The reason people repeat themselves, telling the same stories at family dinners, sharing the same anecdotes with colleagues, retelling jokes to people who have heard them before, is not necessarily diminishing memory for content. It is diminishing encoding of audience. The stories are intact. The listeners are not being recorded. There is also, quietly, something in this finding that speaks to the nature of social connection. Actually encoding the other person, remembering who you told what to, requires paying attention to them as a distinct presence. Most people are too busy performing to notice who is watching. Story 22. When people craft a message specifically designed to persuade an audience, adjusting their argument to fit what the listener wants to hear, They subsequently shift their own beliefs toward the position they argued, even if it differed from their original view. The act of articulating a position in service of an audience restructures the speaker's own attitudes. This is not the same as persuading yourself through internal reasoning. It is the external performance of a position for social purposes, producing genuine internal belief change as a byproduct. The mechanism is cognitive. The brain cannot easily hold "I argued for X" and "I don't actually believe X" simultaneously without discomfort. Rather than resolve the dissonance by acknowledging the performance, it resolves it by updating the belief to match the behavior. The simpler solution is to decide you believe it. The memory of why you said it recedes. The position remains. The implications are significant for anyone in a profession that requires persuasive communication. Lawyers, politicians, salespeople, therapists, academics, where the sustained articulation of positions, even tactically, may gradually reshape the speaker's actual worldview. The advocate who argues a case they privately doubt may, over time, come to doubt their doubt. The politician who delivers lines they were handed may eventually find they believe them. The salesperson who pitches products they were skeptical of may gradually become a genuine believer. You are not just saying what they want to hear. Over sufficient repetition, you are becoming someone who means it. The performance becomes the person. Story 23. The human brain forgets emotional pain faster than it forgets facts and narrative. This asymmetry produces a consistent distortion. The past is remembered more positively than it was experienced, and the present is evaluated against an idealized version of a past that never quite existed as remembered. Declinism, the persistent belief that things were better before and are getting worse now, is not a political position. It is a cognitive artifact produced by an uneven memory system. Surveys across decades consistently show majorities believing society is declining, crime is rising, and morality is deteriorating, regardless of whether the underlying metrics support those beliefs. Steven Pinker has documented at length that by almost every measurable indicator, violence, poverty, infant mortality, literacy, extreme hunger, the present is better than any previous period in human history. The brain's nostalgia machinery makes this impossible to feel. We are living in what is statistically the best time to be a human being, and most people are convinced they missed the good years. The mechanism has evolutionary logic. A mind that remembers past dangers as more dangerous than they were is a mind that becomes complacent. Nostalgic softening of negative memories may motivate return to familiar environments, but in a modern context, it produces chronic dissatisfaction with a present that compares unfavorably to a past that was never quite as described. It also makes historical progress invisible. Each generation fails to appreciate what was solved by the one before it, because the problems being solved have already been forgotten. The golden age is always the decade before the one you remember clearly enough to criticize. Story 24. Barry Schwartz documented the paradox of choice systematically. Beyond a certain threshold, increasing the number of options reduces both the likelihood of making a decision and the satisfaction with the decision made. The famous jam study, 24 varieties drove more traffic to a display, 6 varieties drove more purchases, demonstrated the effect commercially. The mechanism is opportunity cost. Every option chosen means every other option rejected, and the brain obsesses over what was given up. With 3 options, the missed alternatives are manageable. With 30, they constitute a persistent, low-grade regret that taints whatever was actually chosen. The maximizer, the person who needs to know they made the optimal choice, suffers most in conditions of abundance. The satisficer, the person willing to choose something good enough, is paradoxically happier with less. But the maximizer's problem is not an inability to choose. It is an inability to stop evaluating alternatives after the choice is made. The unchosen options remain psychologically present, constituting a perpetual argument that a different decision would have been better. In a culture that has made unlimited choice the highest consumer virtue, streaming services with thousands of titles, restaurants with 100-item menus, dating apps with infinite profiles, the research consistently finds that abundance is making people more anxious, more regretful, and less satisfied with their actual selections. The solution is not to eliminate choice, but to limit it deliberately. People who artificially restrict their options, who decide in advance to only consider 3 candidates, 3 restaurants, 3 versions, make decisions faster, commit more fully, and report higher satisfaction. The constraint is not a limitation. It is a gift the brain gives itself. Story 25. Michael Norton and colleagues demonstrated that people place disproportionately high value on objects they have partially assembled, folded, or constructed themselves, even when the result is objectively inferior to a professionally made alternative. Labor investment creates attachment independent of quality. Participants rated their own IKEA furniture, origami creations, and Lego constructions as worth significantly more than identical items made by others, and expressed willingness to pay more for them at auction. The mechanism appears to involve multiple overlapping processes: effort justification, a sense of competence and self-efficacy that labor produces, and a degree of psychological ownership that emerges from the act of creation. The object becomes an extension of the self in a way that purchased objects do not. Its quality is evaluated partly on its merits and partly on what its creation demonstrates the creator. The IKEA effect has practical implications well beyond furniture. In therapy, approaches that ask clients to generate their own insights consistently outperform approaches that deliver insights directly, not because the client's insights are inherently superior, but because the effort of generating them creates ownership, commitment, and integration that received wisdom does not. In education, students who struggle productively with material before receiving explanation retain it more durably than students who receive explanations first. In management, teams whose members contributed to a strategy implements it more effectively than teams handed a strategy from above. The work is the value. The object, whether a bookshelf, an insight, or a plan, is almost incidental to the attachment that the making of it creates. Story 26. Thomas Gilovich and colleagues put participants in embarrassing t-shirts and had them walk into rooms full of strangers, then asked them to estimate how many people had noticed. Participants consistently overestimated by roughly double. The spotlight effect, the systematic overestimation of how much other people notice, remember, and care about our appearance, mistakes, and social blunders, is one of the most robustly documented findings in social cognition. The underlying mechanism is egocentric anchoring. We experience our own behavior from the inside, with full access to its significance, its backstory, its emotional weight. We then project that salience onto observers who are, in reality, almost entirely occupied with their own internal experience. The person who tripped on the curb, said the wrong thing at the party, or wore the wrong outfit is replaying the incident for days. Everyone else forgot it before they reached the car. The audience that feels so oppressively present is almost entirely a construction of the self-conscious mind. The spotlight effect has significant implications for social anxiety, performance anxiety, and the reluctance to take risks in public. Much of the suffering associated with social embarrassment is not caused by actual negative evaluation by others. It is caused by the imagined negative evaluation of an audience that is, statistically, barely paying attention. This does not mean social evaluation never occurs. It means it occurs far less frequently, and with far less intensity than anxious self-consciousness assumes. The most liberating thing the research can offer to anyone paralyzed by the imagined gaze of others is this: they are not watching nearly as closely as you think. They are thinking about themselves. Story 27. The empathy gap. You have no idea what you'll do when you're hungry, angry, or afraid. George Lowenstein identified one of the most practically consequential failures in human self-knowledge: the visceral empathy gap. When you are in a calm, rational, physically comfortable state, what researchers call a cold state, you are systematically unable to predict how you will think, feel, and behave when you are in a hot state. Hungry, angry, frightened, aroused, in pain. The cold self looks ahead at the hot situation and radically underestimates the pull of it. The evidence is everywhere once you know to look for it. People in a calm state say with confidence they would never steal, never cheat, never lose their temper, and then do all three when sufficiently stressed, hungry, or provoked. Eaters plan their meals with precision and then stand in front of the refrigerator at midnight, making entirely different calculations. People decide firmly they will not gamble large amounts, and then, inside a casino with adrenaline running, discover their cold state resolve has simply ceased to apply. The hot state is not a failure of willpower. It is a neurological state change that the cold self genuinely cannot simulate. The empathy gap also runs in reverse. Hot states cannot accurately predict cold state preferences either. A person in the grip of intense emotion overestimates how long that emotion will persist and how much it will influence future. The implication for self-knowledge is sobering. The self who makes the promise and the self who keeps it are not quite the same person. The gap between them is not a character flaw. It is a neurological reality that rational decision-making has never fully accounted for, and that almost no institution, from healthcare to law, has been designed around. Story 28. Choice blindness. You can be tricked into defending a decision you never made. Lars Hall and colleagues in Sweden ran one of the most unsettling experiments in modern psychology. Participants were shown pairs of photographs and asked to choose the face they found more attractive. The researcher then used sleight of hand, a card trick technique, to pass the participant the photo they had rejected rather than the one they had chosen. A staggering majority of participants failed to notice the swap and immediately began articulating detailed reasons for why they found that specific face attractive. The face they had, seconds earlier, found less attractive than the phenomenon, choice blindness, reveals something profound about the architecture of conscious decision-making. We do not simply make choices and then report them. We make choices, and then we construct post hoc narratives that justify whatever we are holding in our hands. The narrative feels like the reason. It is experienced as the reason, but it is actually a rationalization generated after the fact, in service of a conclusion that was determined by circumstances we are no longer attending to. The experiment has been replicated with consumer products, political opinions, and moral judgments. In one study, participants were manipulated into endorsing a political position they had just rejected, and then gave confident explanations for why they held that view. The conscious mind, it turns out, is less a decision maker than a press secretary, generating persuasive explanations for positions that were arrived at by processes it does not fully observe. The implications for how much we can trust our own stated reasons for our choices, in relationships, in voting, in self-understanding, are significant and largely unaddressed. Story 29. Misattribution of arousal. Your brain mistakes fear for love. In 1974, Donald Dutton and Arthur Aaron sent an attractive female interviewer to two locations: a high, swaying suspension bridge over a 230-foot gorge, and a low, stable footbridge a short distance away. Men who met her on the terrifying bridge were significantly more likely to call her afterward, and their written responses contained more romantic imagery than those of men who met her on the safe bridge. The racing heart, shallow breathing, and heightened arousal produced by genuine fear was misread by the brain as romantic attraction. The physiological signal was the same. The label the brain applied to it was wrong. Misattribution of arousal, the tendency to assign emotional meaning to physical states based on contextual cues rather than accurate introspection, is one of the most reliably reproduced findings in social psychology. Exercise increases self-reported attraction to nearby people. Caffeine amplifies anxiety responses. Anger generated by one source transfers to unrelated. The brain does not experience emotions and then generates physiological responses. It generates physiological responses and then assigns emotional labels based on whatever is contextually plausible, which means the emotion felt is partly a function of the story available, not just the body state. The practical implications are considerable. First dates in exciting or frightening locations, amusement parks, horror films, anything with adrenaline, produce stronger feelings of attraction than equivalent time spent in neutral environments. Therapists working with anxious patients sometimes find the physical sensations of anxiety and excitement genuinely difficult to distinguish. Anger displaced from one relationship onto another explains more interpersonal conflict than most people want to acknowledge. The emotions feel real, specific, and justified. They are also, in part, a labeling error made by a brain that is remarkably bad at identifying exactly what it is feeling and why. Story 30. The illusion of explanatory depth. You don't understand the zipper. Ask someone how well they understand how a zipper works, how a toilet flushes, how a bicycle stays upright. Almost everyone rates their understanding as reasonably solid, somewhere between competent and thorough. Then ask them to explain, in step-by-step mechanical detail, exactly what happens when the zip fastens. The confident rating collapses almost immediately. The person who believed they understood the mechanism discovers, in the act of trying to explain it, that they understood the outcome. The zipper closes, the toilet flushes, the bicycle moves. Without understanding any of the mechanics that produce those outcomes, the knowledge was surfacing all the way down. Leonid Rosenblatt and Frank Keel named this the illusion of explanatory depth in 2002. And it has been documented across domains from mechanical devices to political policies to scientific phenomena. People who believe they understand why a particular economic policy would work, or why a particular law is just, frequently discover on examination that they have a narrative, a sense of the shape of the argument, without the actual mechanistic understanding they believed they possessed. The rating drops when they try to explain. The confidence was an artifact of familiarity with outcomes rather than understanding of processes. The illusion has political and social consequences. Studies find that people hold more extreme positions on complex policies when they are not asked to explain them. The act of attempting a mechanistic explanation produces epistemic humility, a recognition of the limits of one's own understanding that reduces the certainty with which positions are held. The zipper is a relatively harmless place to discover you were overconfident. The policy positions are less so. We govern, argue, and vote on the basis of explanations we cannot actually give. The zipper just makes it visible. Story 31. The Zeigarnik effect. Your brain can't let go of unfinished things. Bluma Zeigarnik noticed something while watching waiters in a Viennese cafe in the 1920s. They could recall complex, multi-course orders with remarkable precision until the bill was paid. After completion, the memory dissolved almost immediately. She investigated systematically and found that interrupted and uncompleted tasks are remembered significantly better than completed ones, not because they are more important, but because the brain maintains an active cognitive loop around anything unresolved, allocating ongoing mental resources to it until closure is achieved. Completion signals the brain to release the data. Incompletion keeps it running. The mechanism appears to involve attention system. Unfinished goals create a persistent low-level activation that keeps them cognitively accessible. This is why the task you abandoned is the one you remember while trying to sleep. Why the conversation you didn't finish. Why does a half-read book sit in the mental foreground in a way a finished one does not? The brain is not simply storing memories. It is actively running background processes on unresolved items, maintaining their accessibility until it receives a signal that they can be safely archived. The Zeigarnik effect has been applied and exploited widely. Television series that end on cliffhangers leverage it deliberately. Advertising that poses a question without answering it keeps the brand active in the cognitive foreground. Unfinished arguments occupy more mental space than resolved ones, which is why the fight you didn't properly close can resurface weeks later with all its original charge intact. Productivity research suggests that explicitly noting the next action for an interrupted task, creating a concrete resumption plan, partially satisfies the brain's unfinished loop and reduces the intrusive mental activation. You don't have to finish everything. You just have to tell your brain what happens next. Story 32. The telescope effect. Your brain lies to you about when things happened. Ask someone when a major news event happened. A political scandal, a natural disaster, a celebrity death, and their answer will almost always be wrong. Not vaguely wrong, systematically wrong, in a predictable direction. The brain compresses and distorts time in two distinct ways depending on the emotional weight and recency of the event. Forward telescoping pulls distant events closer. Something that happened 3 years ago feels like last year because the memory is vivid and emotionally salient. Backward telescoping pushes recent events further away. Something that happened last month feels like ages ago because the brain has processed and filed it as resolved. The distortion is not random noise. It is the predictable output of a memory system that encodes emotional significance rather than calendar time. The effect was first systematically studied in the context of crime surveys, where researchers noticed that victims reported events as more recent than they were, inflating apparent crime rates in ways that corrupted national statistics. The implications extended well beyond criminology. Medical history taking is affected. Patients misdate symptom onset in ways that matter diagnostically. Legal testimony is affected. Witnesses confidently place events in the wrong temporal order. Financial decision-making is affected. People misremember how long ago a loss occurred, distorting their assessment of recovery timelines. The deeper implication is about the reliability of personal narrative. The story you tell about your own life, the sequence of events, the timing of turning points, the duration of difficult periods, is being narrated by a brain that does not keep accurate temporal records. Significant events feel recent because they feel significant. Resolved periods feel distant because the brain has filed them as complete. The autobiography you carry is not a timeline. It is an emotional landscape that the brain has dressed in approximate dates and called history. Story 33. The overjustification effect. Paying someone to do what they love ruins it. In 1973, Mark Lepper and colleagues ran a study with children who loved drawing. Some were told they would receive a reward for drawing. Others drew with no reward mentioned. When the rewards were later removed, the children who had been rewarded showed significantly less interest in drawing than they had before the study began. The reward had not added to their motivation. It had replaced it. The internal drive, I draw because I love to draw, has been overwritten by an external explanation, I draw because I get rewarded. When the reward disappeared, so did the justification, and with it the behavior. The overjustification effect operates through a straightforward cognitive mechanism. People explain their own behavior to themselves the same way they explain other people's behavior, by looking for causes. When an external cause is present and salient, it becomes the internal cause. Intrinsic enjoyment recedes into the background. The person is no longer doing something because it is inherently rewarding. They are doing it for the reward. And anything done for a reward is, by definition, not done for its own sake. The activity has been reclassified from play to work, and the brain adjusts its engagement accordingly. The implications for parenting, education, and management are significant and largely ignored. Praise given for the product rather than the process, grades assigned for curiosity-driven exploration, bonuses tied to creative work, all of these risk undermining the intrinsic motivation. They are nominally. The child who reads for stickers may stop reading when the stickers stop. The employee who creates for performance bonuses may stop creating when the bonus structure changes. The most dangerous thing you can do to something someone loves is start paying them for it. The payment tells the brain it was never really free.